These Barrow Wights have been on my to-do list for a long time, and after seeing them in an awesome, mysterious eerie red on the Rings of Power show, I decided to finally get some paint on them. I even made some scenery to go along with them. First things first, these models suffer from the old GW, I'm made of metal, so I don't get to have many sculpted poses treatment. In fact, there are only two, which is pants. So with a bit of bending and repositioning, I managed to add a bit more posability to the warband and make them a smidge more unique. This little fella was sprayed black to begin with, and we are going to create a pre-shaded look to the Mini with a couple of off-white colours. Using a makeup brush, some grey castle was softly added to the miniature to basically hit the majority of the top surface of the sculpt, whilst leaving some of the darker areas behind for the shadows. I like to use makeup brushes for this as it's not only quick, but the soft bristles help add the paint to the Mini without leaving streaks. And to sharpen those highlighted areas, a lighter paint of Brain Matter Beige was then dry brushed to pick out the edges of the sculpt. By doing so, this pre-shaded look, although looking like a 1920s horror movie vibe, is going to help with our next stage of using Army Painter speed paints. As these paints act like an ink, for example they are high in pigment with an intense colour, but also thin down enough to flow over the surface of the miniature pretty well. For the colour of Poppy Red, I decided to dilute this down more with some medium to make it even thinner, to help the darker and lighter pre-shaded tones show up underneath our layer of paint. After it had dried, I added two more speed paints onto the red rags to help blend and make the bottom areas as well as the shadows even darker. Slaughter Red was added to the bottom half of the cloth, whilst Murder Scene more towards the very bottom and the deeper recesses for the shading. For the first part of the video, we are going to get our white Rodney up to a decent enough tabletop standard ready for a game. And in the second half we'll add some more detail to give him a bit more life, even though he's long dead. The burnished red speed paint was used here for the chainmail as a base colour, ready for a little dry brush of shining silver paint with an old detail brush. I tried to use my brushes one way or another until the very end. So once it's no longer good enough to pick out those fine highlights and details, it does the trashy jobs like dry brushing or dabbing on paint into place like this verdigris. I then picked out the rest of the metals on our Barrow Wight, and this is going to cover the majority of the figure. Starting with the main part, his armour, using polished silver speed paint. And on a side note here, I've got to say that the metallic range of speed paints are superb. They go on super smooth and cover really well. But for the smaller metallic areas, such as the hilt of his sword, crown and armour details, I swapped over to the normal acrylic paint range and used a fine detail brush with these, as they were easier to pick out rather than using our runny speed paints. Both of these were then given a wash to create some shade afterwards. This starts to give our metals on the miniature a bit of depth. And we'll do a bit more on that for the silver on the armour in the second part of the video. Finally, these areas were given a highlight to make these details stand out a bit more. I'm digging the colour scheme for these miniatures so far. Not only would they be good for Middle-earth, but I could definitely see this working in an undead army for Warhammer Old World. Now I'm going to have some fun with the armour, and try something different to the rest of my evil army forces and start creating an aged look to the silver areas. Speed paint Thunderbirds Are Go Blue was patted onto the surface to create some discoloration with its greeny blue tones. And once dry, dark skin wash was treated in the same way by patting on the brush to create a darkened, mottled effect on his armour. Don't worry about being precise and neat. He's dead. He won't care. For the final section of the first part of the video to get him tabletop ready, we focus on the skin and hair. Coming back to speed paints once again for this, Battleship Grey was used as a base coat to initially change our skin colour to more of a creepy, pale grey blue. Whereas Runic Grey that was used afterwards was more of a wash, and this was prodded into the recessed areas of the skin to make them darker and give them a bluish shade. This can best be seen between the fingers, as well as bringing out those facial features. Speed paints are pretty versatile and can be used in a number of ways, which makes them my favourite type of paints as I have a lot of fun using them. And that's what painting minis should be all about. Having fun and bringing minis to life with a bit of colour. Sorry Rodney, you're still dead. Once the 𝗲𝗄𝗆𝗆 Grey speed paint had fully dried for the hair, this was then given a highlight of field grey to make it stand out a bit more. Now with whatever dark magic that is allowing our misguided deceased friend over here to move around, we're going to show this with a glow emanating from his eyes. I wanted to create the dark area first with the black and a deep azure paint to go around the eye socket for our darker blue. This is basically going to frame our lighter colours within, with the next step being a Hydra turquoise to highlight the eye socket above, and a marine mist to pick out the eye and just below it. I just made sure to keep the black still present, so the beady eyes will look brighter next to it in a moment. I spent more time on his face as that's one of the first things you look at when viewing a miniature. That good old saying, faces and bases. For the eyes, they were given a layer of watered down green to tint the colours slightly, before a final dot of afterglow was painted on to give him that piercing look into your soul kind of feel. And that's Rodney done to a fair tabletop standard. We've got a few colours we put on him and he looks nice enough to game with. So you could finish it there and continue with the basing section of the video, or carry on the journey with me to the next stage afterwards. I'm using a blank base here as it's easier to show what I'm doing. Some sand was glued on with PVA and a watered down black was added as a base coat, then left to dry. Much like our pre-shaded miniature, we'll do the same for the base. So a dry brush of any off-white colour was used first, and then a thinned down darkwood speed paint was thrown on, giving you a quick earthy appearance. For me, I'm a sucker for details, so I give my evil armies that little bit extra and give the ground cover some extra coloured tones. I want to set them in more of a desolate plain and give them a patchy look to the ground so it's not all the same colour. Then finish this off with a final dry brush of skeleton bone to pick out the sand mix on the top surface. And I paint the rim of the base a dull greyish brown, which sets them apart from my good guy Middle-earth armies. And lastly, a couple of 2mm static grasses are glued into place. I stick to mainly dead and dried grass here, as not only do my evil armies have a darker look to them, these yellowy greens will stand out more on the bases. But they are also evil! They don't go frolicking around in nice grasses and flowers like my hobbits do. And back to the second part of our Barrow Wight. We'll be adding some highlights and extra details to make the warband stand out a bit more on the tabletop. I like to show you both options for these kind of videos, because everyone has a limited amount of hobby time, including myself. But I do like painting details. For the skin, I wanted to make it more ghastly looking and bring out his bony details a bit more. So there was an initial highlight of 𝗲𝗆𝗆𝗆𝗆 to pick out the fingers and the facial features, and this was followed up with a second highlight of Urban Buff. It's like a slight pale creamy skin colour, resonating that he was alive once long ago. I also picked out the teeth here with this one for his gaunt looking face. To add a bit more depth to miniatures, I like to do this easy little trick of watering down some black paint and painting in some shadow lines in between materials and armor plates. It just breaks up the shapes of the sculpt a bit more so that the eye can see them easier, especially when it's next to a brighter highlight, which we'll do in a moment. But before that, the armor was given another prod with the brush, and this time it was with some verdigris effects paint. I didn't add too much at this point, just some small patches here and there to give that armor a more aged look, but also to give some more visual interest to the miniature. And this was then followed up with a highlight on the armor of shining silver. As the initial speed paint colours that were painted on at the start of the video were quick to apply, I thought I would spend more time adding details like the glowing eyes, the verdigris and the highlights to make them more interesting. And giving them a different colour than a ghostly green or a blue made me more excited to paint them up. So my question of the day is, what miniatures in your collection have you given an alternative colour scheme? For his tatty looking robes, a couple of highlights were added on to where the edges of the sculpt are lighter from our original pre-shading at the start of the video. Just follow these lines as the cloth droops down, as they will act as your guide. I probably spent most of my time on the cloth, as it has the most visual impact on the miniature. I even went back in with a lighter, violent vermilion highlight to the bottom edges of the cloth, just to make these areas stand out even more. So we have come from our tabletop white, mainly using speed paints for the bulk of the base coats, and adding the eye details, to our highlighted miniature which gives us a bit more impact on the tabletop. Now, which unfortunate soul will be the next victim of the Barrow Wights?